Good morning. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, and we're pleased today to do this press conference, the Canadian launch of the Global Terrorism Index, produced annually by the Institute for Economics and Peace. For those of you who are watching the world, we see terrorism continue to impact countries that are friends and allies of Canada. We've seen parts of the Sahel in Africa see violence by groups like Boko Haram, other extremist groups targeting Mali, Burkina Faso, and even a growth into other parts of Africa like the Congo, as well as Mozambique. So the issue of countering terrorism is not just a national issue for Canada, it also touches our foreign policy, it touches our human rights responsibilities, and it means it's also an important aspect that we need to keep an eye on globally and see if Canadians are involving and traveling abroad. It's not just a domestic issue, it's multinational and it's transnational. So we're very pleased today to be here with two distinguished experts to talk about what's happening across the world, what are the trends, what have we seen, and to really inform the Canadian government and Canadian policymakers and members of Parliament themselves on what is happening on the fight against global terrorism. So I would now like to pass the floor to Serge Stroobants from the Institute for Economics and Peace. Serge.
Good morning. My name is Serge Stroobants. I work for the Institute for Economics and Peace as their Regional Director for Europe, Middle East and North Africa, and also as a Global Director for Defense, Security and Intelligence. Well, the Global Terrorism Index 2023 as a highlight the fact that we are now witnessing a plateau in the impact of terrorism worldwide. We have seen a decrease since the peak of the impact of terrorism in the years 2015-16, but in the past 3 years we see the same amount of casualties and the same amount of attacks worldwide. We also see a concentration of this phenomenon in, of course, several hotspots like the Sahel region or the MENA region, Iraq and Syria, or what we call South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, but the epicenter is clearly located in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the only region which deteriorated in the past year, with an increase by 8% of the number of deaths. Globally, 43% of all terrorist attacks occur in the Sahel region, which is basically reduced to two countries being Mali and Burkina Faso, also seeing the largest increase in the number of deaths in the past year, and of course climbing on the Global Terrorism Index as they get more and more impacted. We also see the emergence of other sources of terrorism, especially in northern part of Pakistan, in Balochistan, where the Balochistan Liberation Army has become last year the fastest growing terrorist group in the world. We still see today that the Islamic State and its affiliates is the largest international terrorist group in the world, creating most of the attacks and most of these casualties worldwide also. What we see as drivers for terrorism is still today conflict and political terror. 98% of all terrorist attacks in the world occur in a country which is affected or in conflict and within a 50-kilometer range of this conflict. The second main driver of terrorism would be the application of political terror on your population. And that's easy to understand, because by applying political terror, you basically take away from your population their legal and democratic tools to influence you as a government, and therefore push them towards a decision point to turn violence much faster than in any other form of governance. When we open the time window and we look at the trends in terrorism over the past 15 years, we of course see a continued decrease of the impact of terrorism since 2015-16, an emergence and a really geographical localization of the phenomenon in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Sahel region, as I said before, and of course the predominance of the Islamist forms of terrorism. We see that those forms are worldwide still impacted widely. For example, the Islamic State is still capable today to commit attacks in more than 20 countries, and that's another plateau that we have identified over the past 10 years. When we look at terrorism in the Sahel, we see that Sahel is now the epicenter of terrorism, and those groups who were active in the MENA region before have just migrated in a very opportunistic and flexible way to other parts of the world, Africa and the Sahel region, basically migrating to fertile grounds for their ideology, but also for their business plan, so to speak. So clearly we see that those terrorist groups, once they are under the crush of a security operation, like the coalition against Daesh in the MENA region, well, they just go to other places where a lack of governance, a lack of stability, and a lack of resilience are the main assets for them to be successful in other countries. And that's happening, of course, in the Horn of Africa, and that's happening definitely in the Sahel region. In the MENA region, positive news, so we see a full decrease there, a continued decrease of the impact of terrorism. Again, less attacks last year, about 30% less attacks last year. We also see this phenomenon of suicide bombing almost completely disappearing, about 2,000 casualties generated by those sorts of attacks in 2016 to less than 6 casualties last year. So clearly that's a phenomenon which is getting erased in this part of the world. When we look at terrorism in the West, and that's of course Canada and Belgium, country I come from, we see there that politically or ideologically motivated terrorism as overtaking the jihadist motivation for terrorist attacks. So we see many more politically motivated, and that would be far left and far right motivated attacks rather than Islamist or jihadist attacks in the West. What we also see is a distribution of 3 times more far-left attacks than far-right attacks. But what we also see over the same period of time, that would be 15 years, there is still those jihadist movements and these Salafist movements which generated the highest number of casualties, followed by far-right and obviously far-left, not really focusing in their techniques, tactics and procedures in creating casualties in their actions. So all in all, I would say that global terrorism is still a global phenomenon that we need to take into account. Islamist movements throughout the world are still capable to impact large portions of the world. Of course, we see a geographical concentration in some very specific regions of the world. But at the end of the day, what we see is that they are still capable to be active in a large number of countries in the world, still generating a lot of casualties during a lot of different attacks. In the West, concentration on politically motivation and clearly keeping an eye on other regions of the world where we see an emergence of the terrorist attacks also. One final remark, I think it's very important to understand that imposing a security crush on Daesh, for example, in Syria and Iraq, or on Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, is of course creating conditions for a decrease in the impact of terrorism. But we need to understand that during this period of a security crush, efforts need to be made to increase the levels of resilience of those countries to make sure that once the security crush is released, well, the terrorist groups that were active over there cannot start again where they stopped before the security crush. So clearly there an application of the mitigation of the impact in combination with increased resilience. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Phil Gurski. I'm a Distinguished Fellow in National Security at the Professional Development Institute at the University of Ottawa and a former Senior Strategic Counterterrorism Analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I just want to add on to what Serge was just saying. First and foremost, to thank Serge and his team for producing what clearly is the best single open source summary of terrorism worldwide. I've spent my career in counterterrorism, and I have access only to open source now myself, but I must say it is an incredible research piece that helps to inform us on what's happening on a global level. We here in Canada are blessed. We do not face terrorism to the same levels, not even close, to areas such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Sahel, as Serge just pointed out. But it's important, I think, for two reminders for us here in Canada. First of all, that terrorism abroad does affect us here in Canada. We have diplomatic representations abroad. We have Canadian NGOs that operate abroad, and they are often present in zones, conflict zones, zones where there are insurgencies, where it's possible that acts of terrorism may infect Canadian citizens. Secondly, is that even though we haven't had a lot of terrorism in our country over the past couple of years, that's not to say that terrorism has disappeared completely. We certainly are living in a post-9/11 period where terrorism has assumed perhaps a too large of a profile or an impact on our society's view of national security and public safety. But it still remains true that terrorism is very much a distinct possibility in this country. And I think it's incumbent upon us and our governments to make sure that the people that are in place to protect us, i.e. CSIS, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and other law enforcement agencies are funded to the extent where they can monitor these movements and individuals who subscribe, as Serge said, to a number of ideologies, be they Islamist in nature, far right or far left, so that we can prevent acts of terrorism from happening in our soil. We are a very, very safe country here in Canada, but there is absolutely no guarantee that nothing will happen in the future. And I just hope that governments take this message to heart and make sure that the funding and the resource allocation is there to make us as safe as possible. Thank you.
And in closing, I just tell anyone who's interested, the Global Terrorism Index can be found online for the Institute for Economic Peace website. Please go to it, review it, and see what its main findings are. Thank you.
So if you're online, if you have a question, please use the raise hand function to notify us of your questions. Si vous êtes en ligne et vous avez une question, utilisez la fonction lever la main pour poser votre question. First question, Rachel Haynes, go ahead.
Hi there, this is Rachel Haynes. I'm from CTV. You've pointed out that IS is the deadliest terror group globally, as I read in your press release. Right now, Canada is being called on to repatriate the families of IS fighters who have been detained in camps in northeast Syria. Most of these are their children, and people are calling on Canada to repatriate the mothers as well. And the women who are living in these camps are saying that the government is willing to repatriate their children, but that they would have to give up the custody of their children since they are not Canadian citizens. Do you think that these women are posing such a threat to Canada and Canadian security that this policy of relinquishing custody makes sense?
Well, this is an aspect that is not directly looked upon in the Global Terrorism Index, because we, of course, focus on a certain definition and on the impact of terrorism. But it is clear that this is a situation that needs to be tackled, not only for people, not Canadian nationals or people who left Canada to go and fight in Syria, but definitely also for a lot of Europeans active in the region. I think, not treating those people according to our own principles or norms and values is just like more fuel to the propaganda and the narrative of these international terrorist organizations, which are very, very keen on pointing out the flaws of our societies and the flaws of our systems to promote the excellence of their own system and the qualities of their governance. So I think we need to apply the norms and values which are really the centerpiece of our own Western societies, and that's part of it also. I don't know if one of my colleagues would like to intervene.
Yeah. Thanks, Serge. This is obviously an issue that I followed quite closely when I was with the security service. It's highly problematic. First and foremost, the best place to bring these people to justice is where their crimes were committed, i.e. in Iraq and Syria. This is highly problematic for the reasons that Serge mentioned: lack of governance, instability in the areas. Having said that, bringing them home has problems in and of itself. First of all, do they pose a threat? The answer is potentially. And we did have an attack a few years ago in Scarborough by a returning ISIS member who happened to be female. We've also had a court case here in Ottawa that recently said that the government must repatriate not just women and children, but men who were part of ISIS. Those who have pushed for this particular position have said they can be tried here in Canada. The problem there is that, do we have the evidence in sufficient quantity to come up with an actual court case that would result in the possibility of a conviction and jail time? And that's far from certain at this point. I personally have always advocated the return of children from the get-go, because these children did not make a decision to join Islamic State. They were brought there by their parents, or in fact born within the so-called caliphate. They should have been brought back years ago and not forced to languish in camps such as Al-Hol in Syria. That poses other questions. Do you allow parents to retain custody of their children? Should they be placed with extended family, or in the case of a lack of extended family, as wards of the state? I think this is a very, very complex issue, and one thing that really worries me at the end of the day is there's movement afoot to paint the Islamic State members as victims. They are not victims. The victims are those whom they killed, they raped, in the case of the Yazidis that Kyle referred to. And I think it's really important for us as Canadians to recognize that we're talking about people that joined a terrorist group that killed and maimed tens of thousands of people. And so trying to paint them as those who are suffering, yes, they are suffering in places like Al-Hol, but they're not suffering randomly. They're suffering because they made a conscious decision to join a terrorist group, i.e. the Islamic State. I guess what I'm trying to say here is I think simplistic solutions to complex problems is seldom a good idea, and I think the repatriation of ISIS terrorists is one of those complex problems.
follow-up, Rachel? You're on mute.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. I guess a lot of human rights groups are saying that to let these children and women stay in these camps violates a lot of Canadian human rights. Is there a way, Mr. Gurski, that you see that Canada could repatriate the women and children in a way that would be able to protect Canada's national security?
Yes, there is a way. In fact, some have returned. A number of women have returned in the past few months to Canada. Pending charges is my understanding. But again, as I said earlier, the problem is that does the Crown have enough evidence at hand to actually hope for a successful prosecution in a Canadian court? The witnesses are all over there. They're not here in Canada. The Yazidis who suffered, the Iraqis and the Syrians who suffered are still in Iraq and Syria and in Kurdistan. Bringing them over here would be a Herculean task in terms of logistics. The children you're not going to charge. The children are guilty of nothing. The children are simply the product of people who thought that joining ISIS was a great idea. So to me, I think the repatriation of children is not an issue. The repatriation of the adults is, as I said, problematic from a perspective of, I think most Canadians expect charges to be laid for having, it is an offense under the Canadian Criminal Code to leave Canada to join a terrorist organization. And yes, Islamic State is a listed entity maintained by Public Safety Canada. And so I think that most Canadians would expect something to be done to them. And yet if we have people returning, and because of the aforementioned lack of witnesses and lack of evidence, they essentially are free to resume their former lives, I think a lot of Canadians would feel cheated. Not to mention, I know of at least one case here in Canada of a Yazidi woman who was brought out of the horrors of Iraq and Syria, was walking down the street one day and recognized one of her aggressors, one of the people that actually held her captive in that area of the world, walking free down the street. So again, I think this is a very, very complex issue, and you're absolutely right. Human rights issues, and I think Kyle referred to them and Serge referred to them, are part of the equation of what we have to take into consideration. But I think at the end of the day, that most of us do expect that people that joined a heinous terrorist group, and that's what ISIS was. They violated human rights on a scale almost unimagined over the past couple of decades, should be in fact brought to justice, and therein lies the problem.
Thank you.
And if I could just add to that, I agree with what Phil said. I think we need to keep an eye that those who joined ISIS are not victims. The children are, but what responsibility does Canada have to non-Canadian citizens who are in Syria? I think the answer is we don't have a responsibility. There is nothing in international law that says we must bring back suspected extremists who aren't Canadian citizens to our territory. I think the overarching goal needs to look at the crimes committed by ISIS, which includes the crime of genocide, which is punishable under international law. We have to look at what international justice mechanisms can be used to prosecute these people for the crimes that were committed there in Iraq and Syria. The UN has an investigation team looking at this. We've had the German government, find people guilty of crime against humanity. Women as well. So women that join ISIS are not innocent victims, despite the narrative that's being developed to say so. So I think we need to look at the crimes and hold those responsible, the adults responsible, but help children who are Canadian.
If I may, I would like to come with a Belgian example. Today is the 7th anniversary of the Brussels attacks on the 22nd of March 2016. When we look at this, we see that really the head of the entire operation, really the emir, as they call him, of the entire operation, is somebody who left Belgium in 2003, 2004 to go and fight in Iraq. Was captured by the Americans, served a sentence over there he was sentenced to 10 or 12 years of prison. After 7 years, repatriated to Belgium, arrived in Belgium, was put in front of a judge who basically released him immediately, free in the streets of Brussels. A couple of months later, he left Belgium again, went down to Syria with the Islamic State, became brigade commander of special forces of the Islamic State, and was the brain and the head behind the attacks in Paris and Brussels. So that's something we need to understand also. Once radicalized, I think you will remain radicalized, and your ideas are clear. And the decision that you have made to join the Islamic State comes with consequences. And as Kyle has perfectly said, not with the children, we did not decide to take that step, and we did not make this decision. We basically are victims of the decisions of their parents, but those who clearly decided to leave our country, being Canada, Belgium, or any other Western country, and go and fight or go join the Islamic State, knew exactly what they were doing, and this comes with consequences. And also for the persons involved, but as I just explained, also for our own peace and security in our own country. Thank you.
No more questions, Rachel?
No, I think everybody answered it quite clearly. Thank you so much.
And this concludes the press conference. Thank you very much.
Finito.
Thank you so much for
Muchas gracias.
greeting us and
Yes, thank you.